About 130 years ago in the 1890s, Percy got his family, put them in a covered wagon, and they traveled from Kansas to Denver, Colorado. When they got to Denver, they offloaded from the wagon and they tore everything down and put it all onto a train, livestock and all. The train went about 380 miles south to a little town called Dolores, Colorado, where again they offloaded, reassembled everything, and they rode out quite a few miles to an area known as Goodman Point near the current city of Cortez, Colorado. Percy was doing what a lot of people were doing at that time in American history. He was homesteading a farm. A lot of hard work went into that. They had to break up the soil and plant the seeds, and in time God would bring the rain and the soil provided the nutrition necessary for that seed to grow, and a farm was born. After years and years of that farming, Percy passed the farm on to his son, Paul. Paul did the same thing his father before him had done, but in the course of his years, the advent of the tractor changed things dramatically, and the farm was able to do more and to do well. In time, Paul passed the farm on to his son, Steve, who did the same as his father and his grandfather, but tractors now were being developed in a way where computers were involved, and the enormity of it all was just exponentially greater. And Steve took the farm places that I'm sure his grandfather couldn't even imagine. And as it turns out, Steve in this story is my uncle, Steve Chappell. And he did an incredible job on the farm. Now, knowing that I come from a long line of farmers does not make me very knowledgeable necessarily in farming, but I do know one thing, that there was a rule or a law that each of them lived by. It's been consistent from the very beginning of time and will continue to be consistent. It was a consistent law when they were farming with oxen, pulling rude implements. It was a law when the tractor just came out and when the tractor was fully developed. It's the law we sometimes refer to as the law of sowing and reaping. Sometimes it's called the law of the harvest. Let me give you a little idea of what the law of sowing and reaping is all about. The law of sowing and reaping is this: you reap what you sow. It goes on to say you reap more than you sow. And thirdly, you reap after you sow. That's the law of sowing and reaping. Now, sowing, of course, is referring to planting, and reaping is referring to the harvest. And this law, this farming law, is an analogy that God captured time and again in His Word to help us make the most of the life that He's given us to live. And today I want to read from a passage that shares with us this law of sowing and reaping in Galatians. Paul here is writing to the church in Galatia, and he writes this. He said, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. But he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. And let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not." There's no deceiving God in this process. He knows all. And this passage lets us know that God's not going to be mocked. And so as we break this law down and see how it applies to our lives, we got to begin by understanding the first thought, which is you reap what you sow. If you sow wheat, you'll reap wheat. That's how that works. If you sow friendship, you'll reap friendship. If you sow love, you'll reap love. And it works in reverse as well. If you sow wild oats, you're going to reap a bitter harvest. And God has been so good to us. He's put so many good things in our lives. He gives us so many incredible opportunities. And so let's think for a moment, just what are some things that we can sow in our lives? Well, first of all, we can sow our time. God has given to each of us the same amount of time in the course of a day. The Bible says this in Psalm chapter 90 and verse 12. "So teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom." What's interesting is when you sow your time in an appropriate way, you don't just get to reap the benefits of time well invested. You can literally make an impact for eternity with the way you choose to invest or to sow your time. We know that we can sow what I'm calling here our tactics or our strategies in life. You know, the winner of the war is not always the most ferocious fighter. It's most often the person with the best strategy in the course of the battle. And the tactics or the strategy we employ in life will reap a great dividend or a great yield if it's one that is honoring to the Lord. I love the way the psalmist wrote this in Psalm 25. Show me thy ways, O Lord. Teach me thy paths. Lead me in thy truth and teach me, for thou art the God of my salvation. On thee do I wait all the day. Let me encourage you, ask God, Lord, how would you have me to live my life? What strategy would you have me to employ in seeking to accomplish that which you've given me to do? Here's another area in life in which we can sow, our testimony. You see, if you're a believer, you're a child of God, and your life tells an incredible story. It's a story that deserves to be heard because ultimately, it's not just our story, it's God's story, His story of how He's worked in our lives. In Psalm 126, the Bible says it this way, they that sow in tears shall reap in joy. He that goeth forth and weepeth, bearing precious seed, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him. Now there's an application in that verse of sharing our faith. And as we sow, we'll reap in joy, bringing that harvest with us. And so we're grateful to know that we must sow, and that's where it all begins. But here's the second thought. You reap more than you sow. No farmer would get excited about planting seeds unless there was an expectation that exponentially more would come by way of the harvest than was placed in the earth by way of planting. For example, if you had a single kernel of corn and you decided to plant that, a stalk would grow. And on that stalk of corn, you'd have 3 or 4 ears of corn. I've read the typical ear of corn has about 400 kernels of corn on it. So if I did my math right, if you plant 1 kernel of corn, you ultimately in the end, just from that 1 kernel, could see a yield, a harvest of somewhere between 12 and 16 kernels of corn. That's an exponential increase. Why is that? Because you reap more than you sow. Now let's think about that and apply it to our lives. Think of what it is that Jesus said. In Luke 6 and verse 38, He said, give and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over shall men give into your bosom. For with the same measure that you mete withal, it shall be measured to you again. We also find here an application that God can take that which we give and He can bless it and He can use it. Now let's think again of the verse we began with in Galatians chapter 6. There in that passage it said, for he that soweth to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, but he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. You see, if we live only for fleshly things or for temporary things, the Bible says that life, it's going to see corruption. It's a wasted life. But when we live for the things of God, He can use our lives in ways we wouldn't even have imagined. I love the verse that's so often referenced, but it encourages us in this regard. Ephesians 3 and verse 20. Now unto Him that is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that worketh in us. Man, as we give our life to God, we know that He can do more through us than we ever could do on our own. He can do more than we would ever have imagined. And that leads to the final thought I'll share with you here in this law. You reap after you sow. Now, this is a reality in farming. We have to plant seeds and wait for the harvest. There's no immediate gratification in farming. There's a process that is consistent throughout. The writer of Hebrews helps us with this. In Hebrews 10 and verse 36, he said, for you have need of patience, that after ye have done the will of God, ye might receive the promise. Now we all want the promise, but there's a premise that comes before the promise. And the premise there is after ye have done the will of God. You know, someone could say, well, Pastor, I read my Bible today and I'm still struggling in an area of my life. Yeah, there's a process through which we have to work. A husband could say, for example, you know, Steve, I've been real nice to my wife and I'm not yet feeling the love. Well, there's a process through which we must go. A parent could say, I'm trying to apply biblical wisdom when it comes to being a parent, and still my kids seem a little bit extra rowdy today and they've got me on my last nerve. Well, listen, all of those statements may be true, but the promise in the law is this. And let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap. No doubt about it, we shall reap if we faint not. I love the story of President Andrew Jackson. Shortly after he was elected, the story is told. Some of his childhood friends were talking, and they just couldn't believe their friend became the president, and they couldn't believe it because, frankly, they never really saw him as all that special. As the story is written, these friends, these childhood friends, are talking. And one of them says, why, Jim, who lived down the pike, was not only smarter, but he could throw Andy 3 out of 4 times in a wrestling match. But look where Andy is now. The story says there was a period of silence when one of them added this. How did there happen to be a 4th time? The point was, you could throw Andy, who had become President Andrew Jackson, 3 times, but he was going to get up 1 more time than he'd been thrown, and ultimately he would prevail. What was he doing? He was fainting not. He was pressing on. That's a lesson we all need. I had a friend call me not too long ago, and as we entered into that conversation, I reflected on our previous conversation, where he was saying to me, Steve, I just don't get it. I'm trying to do everything I know that's right to be done. I'm trying to honor the Lord, and it seems like I'm just frustrated in every area of my life right now. And I frankly didn't know what to say to him other than to just encourage him to continue on for the Lord. On this phone call, however, it was a very different conversation. He said, Steve, I don't get it. I'm not doing anything different than I have been doing, but it seems like I'm finally seeing some breakthroughs in areas of my life. And he said, I don't get it. I'm doing the same things I've been doing, but I've got to tell you, in that moment, I got it. What he was doing was reaping a harvest from seeds that had been planted, and he wasn't fainting in his well-doing, and in time, the turnaround came. Listen, friends, in these days in which we're living, I want to encourage you with this simple thought today. Don't be weary in well-doing. Hey, the law of sowing and reaping, or the law of the harvest, it's true in the Bible, it's true practically in farming, and it's true in our lives. These days we're living in have a way of making us feel weary. So today I say, listen, don't get weary in well-doing, for surely you will reap if you faint not. Let's live this law out in our lives today for the glory of God.